All right, welcome in everyone to another deep dive from Safety One Source.
Absolutely, and this one's going to be a good one.
Definitely. Yeah, we've got a huge stack of questions this time, and they're all about construction safety and how OSHA views some common situations on the job site.
That's right. And, it's always good to get into the nitty-gritty of how OSHA actually thinks about these things.
Definitely helps us all stay on the right side of the regulations and, most importantly, keep people safe out there. So without further ado, let's dive right in. We've got this first one here, and it's about power tools, specifically the ones that come back from repair in pieces.
The dreaded irreparable tool.
Exactly. So the question is, if a repair service says, this electric hand tool is toast, can't fix it, and they send it back disassembled, does OSHA have a rule that says it's got to stay that way?
Well, I'll cut to the chase for you. OSHA said that, no, there's not a specific construction standard, like in Subpart I or K, that makes it mandatory to keep a tool disassembled just because it can't be repaired.
So no hard and fast rule about disassembled means it stays disassembled. But it's OSHA, so I'm guessing there's more to consider here.
Oh, absolutely. While they don't specifically say you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again, there are a bunch of related standards that really matter in this situation. One of the big ones is 1926.302A1, which is all about making sure electric tools are either double insulated or grounded. That's essential, right?
Yeah, for sure. Those are the basics of electrical safety. And I think it's 1926.403A that also says any electrical equipment needs to be approved. Can you remind our listeners what approved really means in OSHA speak?
Good point. So approved basically means it's gotten the okay from a qualified testing lab. Think about when a tool's brand new right out of the box. That approval applies to the whole thing working as it's supposed to. And this is where the disassembled irreparable tool situation gets interesting because any repairs have to bring it back to that original approved state.
So if the repair folks have said it's beyond repair, there's no way to just put it back together and magically make it meet that safety standard again, right?
Exactly. And here's where it gets super important for everyone listening. 1926.2ZB3 flat out says you cannot use any equipment that doesn't comply with OSHA standards. So since that irreparable tool wouldn't be double insulated or grounded properly, trying to use it would be a direct violation. And that's why those repair shops send them back in pieces. They're trying to prevent anyone from accidentally putting it back into use.
So the big takeaway here isn't so much about the disassembly itself, but about not using unsafe tools. You've got to have a system like those do not use tags to make it clear that these tools are off limits.
You got it. Simple, but so important for preventing accidents.
Okay, moving on to something a bit different. Training for those powered industrial trucks, specifically skid steer loaders used for earth moving on construction sites. I know we've got a lot of listeners who work with these machines. The question here is about whether the usual training rules under OSHA 1910.178 SIN apply to skid steers.
Great question. And it's a crucial one because those 1910.178 rules are usually what folks think of for forklift training, right? But for skid steers used in construction primarily for moving earth, OSHA said no, that specific training doesn't apply.
Okay, so the forklift training isn't the perfect fit here, but I'm guessing that doesn't mean you can just throw someone on a skid steer with no training at all.
Absolutely not. Even though 1910.178 doesn't fit the bill, there's another regulation that comes into play, and that's 1926.21B2. This one's all about employers providing training so employees can spot unsafe conditions and know the rules that apply to their work. For skid steer operators, this means going beyond just the basic how-to of the machine. You've got to train them on the specific hazards of earth moving, like navigating uneven ground, dealing with blind spots, and making sure they can communicate effectively with the ground crew.
So training's got to be super specific to the work they're doing and the risks on that site. Now, what if you've got someone who says, hey, I've been running skid steers for years, I know what I'm doing. Does that experience automatically qualify them?
Well, OSHA's addressed this in 1926.20B4, and what they've said is that while experience is good, it doesn't automatically mean someone's qualified in OSHA's eyes. Qualification's all about showing they actually have the knowledge and the skills to work safely in those particular conditions. So it's not just about how long they've been operating, but can they demonstrate they know how to do it safely on your work site?
So demonstrated competence is the key, not just years on the job. Makes sense. Now, this next topic can be a bit of a head scratcher on those busy construction sites with multiple contractors, the multi-employer citation policy. It can get confusing, so the question is, can more than one employer get cited for violations of those basic safety program rules like 1926.20B1, B2, or 1926.21B2?
The simple answer is yes, absolutely they can. And the multi-employer citation policy is the reason why. The core idea here, and it's a big one for anyone managing safety with multiple contractors, is that if an employer exposes an employee to a hazard, they can get cited.
So if, let's say, a subcontractor creates a hazard, but my workers are exposed, we could be cited too, even though we didn't create the hazard.
That's right. But it goes further than that. Even if your workers aren't the ones exposed, if you are what OSHA calls a creating, correcting, or controlling employer, you could still get a citation.
Okay, so it's not just about whose employees are directly at risk. Can you break down those different employer roles for our listeners and what responsibilities each one has?
Sure. So the creating employer, they're the ones who made the hazardous situation. Then you've got the correcting employer, and their job is to fix the problem. And the controlling employer, they're the ones who have the overall say on the site and the power to make sure things get fixed.
And how does OSHA actually decide who gets cited when there are all these different employers involved?
They've got a two-step process. First, they figure out what role the employer plays. Are they creating, exposing, correcting, or controlling the hazard? Then they look at whether that employer did what they were supposed to based on their role. And remember, the level of responsibility changes depending on the role. A controlling employer, they have to take reasonable steps to prevent problems and find violations. But it's not the exact same level of oversight they'd have for their own workers.
So really understanding those roles and how they relate to the specific hazard is crucial. Now let's get into a very specific on-site hazard. Imagine you've got glue spread out on a floor, getting ready for carpet installation, and there's a risk of someone slipping. Is there an OSHA rule that says you have to have signs or barriers up?
It seems obvious, right? Slippery floor, got to warn people. But here's the thing. There's no specific construction standard in OSHA that says you must have signs or barriers for that exact situation.
Really? No specific rule for wet glue on the floor? That seems surprising. But I'm assuming employers still have some responsibility here.
Oh, definitely. Even if there's not a specific rule about glue, you've always got the General Duty Clause, which is Section 5A1 of the OSH Act. This clause says employers got to keep the workplace free from recognized hazards that could cause death or serious injury. And a big puddle of glue, that's definitely a recognized hazard. But here's where it gets a little tricky. Under the multi-employer citation policy, it's usually the exposing employer, the one whose workers are actually in danger of slipping, who gets cited for a General Duty Clause violation.
So in that glue situation, it'd probably be the carpet installers who are responsible for keeping their own crew safe around the wet glue. What if an employer decides to be extra cautious and put up signs anyway? Are there rules for the signs themselves?
Yes, if you are putting up signage, make sure it meets the requirements in 29 CFR 1926.200. That covers all the details about accident prevention signs and tags, things like the colors, the wording, and the symbols. And remember, consistency is key, right? If you're using signs all over the site, keep them consistent so everyone knows what they mean.
Absolutely. Consistent signage is so important. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about the relationship between general industry standards, those found in Part 1910, and the construction standards in Part 1926. The question is, can those Part 1910 rules be enforced on a construction site, even if there's no specific construction standard covering that exact hazard? And they use the example of 1910.146 for confined spaces, referencing 1926.20D.
Yes, this is a bit of a gray area sometimes, isn't it? Well, 1926.2D2 might seem to suggest you could just use a general industry standard if there's no specific construction one. OSHA is generally a bit stricter than that. Usually they'll only enforce a Part 1910 standard on a construction site if they've specifically said it applies in a Federal Register notice.
So unless OSHA has explicitly said this Part 1910 rule applies to construction, you generally shouldn't assume it does.
That's the safest bet.
Yeah.
And to use your example, 1910.146, the permit required confined spaces standard, that's not one they've specifically said applies to construction.
So even if there's a confined space hazard on a construction site, OSHA wouldn't cite 1910.146 directly. What would they do instead?
They wouldn't use that specific number, no, but it doesn't mean they ignore the hazard. If there's no matching construction standard, but the hazard is addressed in a well-recognized standard, like ANSI Z117.1 for confined spaces, they might cite you under the General Duty Clause. And
They can always use 1926.21, which is about training, if the training for confined space entry was inadequate. But they'd have to show that the training fell short of what a reasonable employer would provide.
So it's really about demonstrating that you failed to take appropriate safety steps, even if there's not a perfect matching rule. Okay, let's get into some lifting equipment. We got a question about a particular below-the-hook lifting device called the Contex Magic Arm. It's used with a crane to move loads below floor level, and the question is what OSHA rules apply?
Interesting piece of kit. Now, OSHA's general stance is that they don't give a thumbs up or thumbs down to specific products. There are just too many variations on job sites, and they can't vouch for how every piece of equipment is used and maintained. But what they do is point you to the regulations that would cover how that equipment's being used.
So no official OSHA seal of approval, but they can guide us toward the relevant rules. What are those in this case?
Whenever you're hoisting stuff in construction, you got to keep several big standards in mind. There's 1926.14 on, which is all about cranes and derricks. And then 1926.753 specifically covers hoisting and rigging and steel erection. And of course, as we always say, those general training requirements in 1926.20b and 1926.21b2 are always in play. Make sure everyone's trained properly on any equipment they're using.
Now, for this magic arm thing, would OSHA consider it part of the rigging?
Absolutely. If it's attaching the load to the crane, it's rigging, plain and simple. And that means 29 CFR 1926.251 kicks in. That standard's got some big requirements, like inspecting all your rigging before each shift and as needed while you're working. And if you find anything wrong with it, got to take it out of service immediately.
Regular inspection, super important for anything involved in lifting. Are there other hazards that might come up when you're using something like this magic arm?
Just like that glue example, the general duty clause could come into play here too. If there are other hazards that are recognized as being associated with how the magic arm is being used, OSHA might use that clause, depending on the specifics of the job. So it's best to check out industry standards, like ASME B30.20A 2001. That one specifically deals with below-the-hook lifting devices and talks about the hazards and how to stay safe.
So even without a specific rule for the magic arm, employers still got to make sure it's used safely, following those general hoisting and rigging standards, and addressing any hazards they can see, maybe by using those industry best practices. Let's move on to something everyone's familiar with, those ground fault circuit interrupters, or GFCIs. Someone's asked if there's a requirement to test them on construction sites.
This one trips people up sometimes. OSHA's 1926.404b1, it doesn't explicitly say you have to test your GFCIs.
Yeah.
But don't let that fool you. Testing is still really important.
So the rule doesn't scream, test those GFCIs, but it's definitely a good safety practice, right?
Right. Remember 1926.20, that one says you got to regularly inspect all your equipment, and that includes GFCIs. Plus, most manufacturers recommend testing them regularly, usually once a month, just to be sure they're working as they should. If you're following those manufacturer guidelines and keeping records of your tests, you're showing OSHA you're taking safety seriously. And of course, if you find a GFCI that's not working right, you got to replace it right away.
So testing frequently and documenting it, those are the keys to showing you're on top of things, even if OSHA doesn't give a specific testing schedule. Now let's talk about qualifications for drivers. What does OSHA have to say about the folks driving heavy trucks and those commercial motor vehicles, the CMVs, on construction sites?
This all comes back to that general OSHA rule about qualifications, which is 1926.2b4. It basically says only qualified people, meaning they've got the training or experience, are allowed to operate equipment. And that includes those big trucks and CMVs. So you, as the safety person, have to make sure those drivers have the skills and knowledge to operate those vehicles safely, especially on a construction site where things are always changing.
Sounds similar to the skid steer operator situation. Got to make sure they're truly qualified for the specific work. Now, what if those trucks are hauling hazardous materials? Are there extra rules for that?
Absolutely. If you're dealing with hazmat transportation, you got to follow the DOT's rules, the whole shebang. That means driver qualifications, placards on the trucks, loading and unloading procedures, everything. It's a whole other ballgame.
Right. Hazmat transport is a whole other level of regulations. And what about those states that have their own OSHA plans, like Washington State, which we see mentioned in the material sometimes? Do those state rules matter too?
Yes, 100%. If you're in a state with its own OSHA-approved plan, they might have extra rules or rules that are a bit different from the federal ones. So you have to know both sets of rules, federal and state, and make sure you're following all of them.
Always check those local rules. All right, moving on to descent control devices, things like those figure eights, racks, and those Sky Genie systems. What does OSHA say about using those in construction?
Well, As of right now, and this is based on what OSHA said in those materials you provided, there aren't specific rules in Part 1926 just for descent control devices.
Really? No specific rules for that? You'd think with the risks of working at height there would be.
You'd think so, but that doesn't mean OSHA doesn't care about it. There are general requirements that apply. For example, 1926.501A2 says all working surfaces have to be strong enough to support workers safely. And remember, those training rules, 1926.2B4 and 1926.21B2, those always apply. You have to make sure those workers are trained to properly use those descent control devices.
So making sure those ankle points are solid and the workers are trained, those are the basics. But what about past guidance from OSHA on this stuff? Has there been anything?
Actually, yes. OSHA said in their response that some of their older policies, from memos and letters, are still in effect, but with one big change. They no longer allow body belts for fall arrest. That's been updated in 1926.502D. So let me run through some of the key points from that older guidance that you should still be following. First, training's a must. Before anyone uses these devices, they got to be trained. Then, every day, those devices need a thorough inspection. And when you're rigging them up, you got to do it right, using solid anchor points, good tiebacks, and being extra careful with anything that's not a permanent anchor. You also got to make sure those lines are strong enough, at least 5,000 pounds tensile strength. And padding on the ropes, that's important to prevent wear and tear. If you're going down further than 130 feet, you also need those intermittent stabilization measures. But here's the really big one. You need a completely separate fall arrest system, one that meets the requirements in 1926.502B. That means a full body harness, a rope grab, a lifeline, and a proper anchor point. And lastly, you've got to have a plan in place for rescuing someone quickly if they do fall, which is covered in 1926.50220. So even without one specific rule, OSHA has given us a good roadmap here.
That's a lot to consider, but it's all really important stuff. Now, let's get super specific with a particular piece of equipment. This is the Woltman PVE 5021S, which is a pile driving rig. The question is, do the rules in 29 CFR Part 1926 Subpart N apply to this specific machine?
All right, time to get technical. This one requires a deep dive into the actual design of this equipment and how it lines up with what Subpart N is all about. And OSHA's done that analysis, and their answer is no, Subpart N doesn't apply to the Woltman PVE 5021S.
Straight to the point. Can you walk us through why they made that decision?
Sure. Subpart N is specifically tied to the definitions in a couple of big industry standards. One is PCSA2, that's the Power Crane and Shovel Association standard for mobile hydraulic cranes. And the other is ANSI B30.5 1968, the safety code for crawler, locomotive, and truck cranes. OSHA took a really close look at how the Woltman PVE 5021S is built. It uses a hydraulic mast attached to a rotating superstructure, and it doesn't have a typical crane boom or the usual ways of attaching leads. Because of these design quirks, they said it doesn't fit what PCSA2 describes for self-erecting piling rigs.
So it's not your typical crane-type pile driver, which means PCSA2 doesn't really apply. What about that ANSI standard, the B30.5 1968?
Same story there. That ANSI standard is all about those crawler, locomotive, and truck cranes that use engines or electric motors and have drums and ropes for lifting. The Woltman PVE 5021S uses hydraulics to move its leads up and down, and it's not primarily used for lifting like those other cranes.
So because it's hydraulic and its main job is pile driving, not lifting stuff, it doesn't match the definitions in either of those standards, which means Subpart N is out. But does that mean there are no OSHA rules for this thing at all?
Not at all. Remember those general safety and health requirements in 1926.2S? Those still matter a lot. Specifically 1926.20B2, that's the one about regular inspections by a competent person, making sure the equipment's safe. But here's the catch. Those specific load tests and operational tests you see in ANSI and PCSA2, those don't apply here. That's because this equipment isn't covered by those standards.
That's an important distinction. The general duty to inspect, that's always there. But those very specific tests, they only apply if the equipment falls under those particular standards. What about other industry standards, though? Could those be used to ensure it's operated safely?
OSHA's said that if there's no specific OSHA rule for a piece of equipment, but there are other industry standards out there, and the equipment is used unsafely, they could use those standards as evidence to cite you under the General Duty Clause.
So even without Subpart N applying, you still got to operate that Woltman PVE 5021S safely. If you don't, they might use those other standards to show you weren't doing things right. Now let's shift gears and talk about self-audits. A lot of companies do these to find potential safety issues, but the question is, could OSHA turn around and use those findings against you later if they decide to inspect?
I hear this concern a lot, and it makes sense. Companies want to be proactive, but also want to protect themselves. OSHA has said that if you find serious hazards during a self-audit, but don't take steps to fix them, they could definitely take action based on those uncorrected hazards. But remember, the point of a self-audit isn't just to find problems, it's to fix them. That's how you show OSHA you're committed to safety. So have a system for keeping track of what you find, assign people to fix the problems, and then check that the fixes were done right. That kind of proactive approach, that's what OSHA wants to see.
So self-audits aren't a get-out-of-jail-free card. If you find problems but ignore them, it could actually make things worse for you. Last but not least, let's talk about assessing craft skills. Does OSHA require specific tests for this?
This one's pretty straightforward. OSHA said they don't require employers to give specific tests to figure out how skilled their craft workers are.
So no need for special certifications or standardized tests straight from OSHA.
Nope. But OSHA is also very clear that the employer is responsible for making sure their employees have the skills and knowledge they need to do their job safely. When OSHA checks out your training program, they're more likely to watch how people are working and talk to your employees to see if they know what they're doing, rather than asking for test results. They care about whether your workers can do their jobs safely, and it's up to you to figure out the best way to make sure that happens. Maybe it's formal training. Maybe it's checking their past experience. Maybe it's something else entirely.
So flexibility for the employer, but the responsibility is always there.
Okay, let's take a moment to sum up all this great info we've covered in this Safety One Source deep dive, designed specifically for you folks who are keeping our workplaces safe. We had a ton of awesome questions and OSHA interpretations today, covering everything from those broken tools to the intricacies of equipment standards and the whole multi-employer puzzle. And I think the big takeaway here is that safety isn't just about memorizing rules. We've seen how OSHA often focuses on those core principles. Equipment has to be safe and in good working order. Training has to be thorough and relevant to the actual work. You can't ignore hazards, even if there's no specific rule. And everyone on a site needs to understand their responsibilities.
So for our listeners, this all means you need a good understanding of the rules, for sure, but you also need to think critically and be proactive about finding and controlling hazards. Don't just look for a rule that fits your exact situation. Think about what the rules are trying to accomplish and how those ideas apply to the challenges you face every day.
And that brings up an important question for you to think about. How are you doing at actually applying the spirit of those OSHA rules, not just checking boxes? Are there things we talked about today that could help you make your workplace even safer? How can these insights improve your next safety meeting, your next job hazard analysis, or even just how you look at things when you're walking around a site? I hope this deep dive has answered some questions, but also got you thinking about how to make safety a priority in everything you do.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time, stay safe out there.